Good afternoon and welcome to our first Acton lecture series of 2025. Thrilled to have all of you here in person as well as those of you who are joining us on live stream. So thank you for being with us today. My name is Noah Gould and I oversee alumni and student programs here at the Acton Institute, and it's so wonderful to see you all here. The format today will be a 30-minute lecture followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you have questions, keep those ready and we'll be passing around a microphone to ask our speaker questions today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Caleb Franz, who is the author of The Conductor, the story of Reverend John Rankin, abolitionism's essential founding father, released on October 15 through Post Hill Press, and I've heard that it's already on its second print run, so this is a wonderful book that I hope you'll all pick up after the lecture. Caleb's work has been featured in various outlets, including Time, Real Clear History, The Washington Examiner, The Independent, the Louisville Courier Journal, and more. He is also the program manager at Young Voices. Caleb lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife, Danielle, and I'm pleased to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Caleb Franz.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending this lecture. I'm very excited to be able to speak with you on the life of Reverend John Rankin. What is it that could possess a man to risk his life, the safety of his family, and the harmony of his community for someone that he has no connection with and will likely never meet again? For so many of us today, goodwill is toward our fellow man is conditional. If and only if we can guarantee our own comfort and our own safety, do we consider the well-being of strangers. In our modern age, we avoid conflict and discomfort by all means possible, even if it means complacency towards a greater injustice at hand happening before our very eyes. This makes it, I think, all the more ironic that as we recall the great atrocities throughout history, such as the persistence and perseverance of slavery in the United States, we like to believe that we would be on the right side of history, envisioning ourselves in this modern day as these would-be heroes. The luxury of distance of time often prevents us from considering the real sacrifices that ordinary, everyday people made toward a freer society. Our modernity, paired with the growing secularization of society, inhibits our ability to understand the reason why so many ordinary people would make such a sacrifice in the first place. The history of the American abolition movement is not one of comfortable goodwill. Throughout most of their existence, abolitionists were hated by people both in the North as well as the South. Even those who were otherwise opposed to the institution of slavery hesitated to call themselves or adopt the title of abolitionist. It was a label that invoked a special kind of rage throughout the country. To call oneself an abolitionist openly was to invite violence and vitriol upon yourself and your household. For those who committed themselves to this cause, threats of violence did not deter them, though. For so many of these figures, it was a matter of Christian duty to participate in the fight against slavery. Such was the case for the man that many considered to be the leader of their movement, Reverend John Rankin. Although he's nearly forgotten about today, Reverend Rankin was very well renowned in his own time. Rankin's contemporaries often considered him to be the father of abolitionism in the United States, sometimes referring to him as the Martin Luther of the cause. His intellectual, moral, and spiritual leadership was critical to the successes of the abolitionists throughout the 19th century. Despite the pivotal role that he played, however, he never intended to assume a position of authority. In fact, he was arguably the most unlikely figure to achieve any kind of national prominence. The impact that Rankin made throughout his life, as well as the sacrifices that he made for total strangers on the Underground Railroad, can only really properly be understood when we fully comprehend and understand the role that Rankin's faith played in his story. Every action that Rankin took was done in pursuit of God's calling for his life. That calling, as he understood it, was to vanquish slavery from the United States. Now, as I mentioned, in hindsight, Rankin was a very unlikely figure to be the leader of such a cause. Whereas so much of the abolitionist movement would soon develop and prosper in places like New England or in the Northwest Territory, in the Western Reserve in Ohio. John Rankin was born and raised in the hills of eastern Tennessee, near the small community of Dandridge, on February 4th, 1793. The Rankins, for all intents and purposes, were pioneers of the Tennessee frontier. Unlike so many of the great minds of the 18th century who were often born into wealth or mansions, John Rankin was born in a log cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness. His father, Richard, was a somewhat exceptional pioneer in that he was self-educated. Unlike most of his neighbors, Richard could read and enjoyed doing so, a trait that he also passed on to his son. Particularly, Richard read history and scripture and would often read both to John. In the midst of a relatively simple childhood, there was one event that affected John more than any other. Around 1800 and 1801, the Second Great Awakening swept through the region. Rankin's father brought him to nearby camp meetings, and as Rankin put it, a wonderful nervous affection pervaded the meetings. Some would tremble as if terribly frightened. Some would have violent twitching and jerking. Others would fall down suddenly, as if breathless, and lie during hours. Now, John was raised in a very Calvinistic household, so this kind of emotional sensationalism that defined the awakening confused him, leading to severe anxiety and then eventually to frequent episodes of depression. He recalled entering a season of coldness around this time and passed into a state of darkness and doubt. Rankin would sit back and watch charismatic preachers lure in followers through raw emotional appeal, regardless of the truth behind their preaching, and he would later remark that, quote, Satan took advantage of the extreme excitement to mislead many souls, although he did also admit later that it is believed that there was genuine conversions among them. Seeing others swept up in the excitement around him, Rankin recalled feeling as if he had been passed by and was not one of God's elect. Still, Rankin pressed forward in his study of Scripture. He often anguished, but he made what he referred to as certain mental adjustments to carry through his teenage years without being crippled by the state of his mental health. Now, things slightly improved as he pursued his education at Washington College near Jonesboro, Tennessee, studying under the tutelage of Reverend Samuel Doak, who served as a pivotal mentor to Rankin as he wrestled with God's purpose for his life. Undoubtedly, however, the single most sobering and clarifying moment in Rankin's early life was the death of his brother, David. As the War of 1812 broke out, David's sense of duty drove him to volunteer in the Army. He served as a lieutenant and fought at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend under General Andrew Jackson. While this battle was an undoubted victory for the Americans, it was paid by the life of people like David. He was 2 years older than myself, he wrote, John that is, and was my companion from childhood to manhood. The news of his death caused me inexpressible sorrow. Now, following David's death, the government provided the Rankin family with compensation for his services in the war. This turned out to be a blessing in more ways than one. Richard Rankin at this time was simultaneously facing financial hardships and struggled to afford John's education at Washington College. These funds allowed John to finish his education and subsequently enter the ministry. As he returned to school, John also met the person who I think was probably the most important rock in his life, which would be his wife, Jean, who was also a granddaughter to his friend and mentor, Samuel Doak. It was clear to Rankin that this was all God's design. He may have been uncertain exactly what that purpose looked like and what it was that he was meant to do, but he was prepared to surrender himself and do as the Lord commanded. The revelation of his purpose came rather quickly after John began his ministry. As his license to preach was approved by the Abingdon Presbytery, they accepted him but noted, quote, with the suspicion and distrust because of his frequent expression in opposition to slavery. Rankin started preaching in the spring and summer of 1817. His first few sermons were relatively tame and non-controversial. But as he grew in his confidence, he also grew in his convictions. Now, later that summer, John delivered a sermon in which he highlighted Scripture's opposition to what he referred to as all forms of oppression. While he did not mention slavery directly by name, the audience could read between the lines, and knowing his background and his vocal opposition, the church instructed him to never preach on the subject of slavery or oppression ever again. Now, John Rankin was not one to be deterred, and weeks later, he again was preaching against oppression, this time at a different church. Here, John took it a step further, emphasizing the Christian duty to oppose slavery itself. The elders at this church again pulled him aside after he was finished and suggested that a man with such convictions might better take his preaching to a free state. Now, Rankin was not one to be intimidated, nor would he shy away from a just cause, but he did see the logic behind the suggestion. After much consideration and prayer, he finally decided to take his wife and his infant son, Adam Lowry Rankin, to the free soil of Ohio. Rankin understood that in doing so, this meant that he would have to leave his family behind. Due to the difficulty of such a journey and the ruggedness of the western wilderness at the time, or what was then the West at the time in the Appalachian frontier, John knew that he would likely never see his parents alive ever again. Following the death of their son David, Richard and his wife Jane would be losing yet another son. But Christ called John Rankin to follow him, and thus, after an emotional departure, Rankin took his first steps in a leap of faith. Now, Rankin's journey to Ohio was anything but smooth. He and his family faced challenges very early on in this process. Notably, Rankin would recall when one of the wheel axles on the carriage that they were using split into two, requiring him to go off in search of a blacksmith. His wife, son, and all their belongings had to have been left on the side of the road, helpless, at a time when bandits and thieves were known to roam the Kentucky wilderness. Now, to his relief, Rankin returned back to that spot to find his family undisturbed. In fact, the only bypasser that they experienced, he noted, had a large drove of pigs. And the pigs, Rankin was pleased to report, behaved civilly. To Rankin, Kentucky was only ever meant to be the state that stood in between his home of eastern Tennessee and his future in Ohio. But along the way, Rankin would offer his services as a minister in return for lodging over the Sabbath. As he made it to Paris, Kentucky in the late fall of 1817, he called upon Reverend John Lyle, who was happy to allow Rankin to preach and to stay with him. Now, Lyle recognized a certain special quality in Rankin that Rankin possessed after hearing him preach, and tried to convince him to go to Carlisle, Kentucky, and serve as their pastor at the Concord Church. Rankin was a bit surprised by this proposal. After all, he was opposed to slavery. He said, quote, "I designed to go to Ohio as it was a free state." But Lyle was persistent. Eventually, Rankin agreed to stop there only on his journey to Ohio, preach a few sermons, and then continue on his way. This plan was immediately unraveled. As his arrival in Carlisle, his horse collapsed and would need some time to recover. With winter on the horizon, Rankin agreed to remain in Carlisle for about 6 months or until spring arrived. Now, during these 6 months, Rankin's anxiety and his depression that he knew in his teenage years returned in full force. He started to struggle to develop new material each Sunday as a permanent pastor, and he wondered if he mistook God's calling for his purpose in life. He even considered giving up the ministry entirely. His wife, Jean, though, was his rock throughout this period of doubt. Snapping Rankin out of his rut, she insisted that God's calling remained clear. Now, she pressed, God was calling Rankin to improve his skills as a preacher. If he was to fight against slavery, he must overcome these shortcomings. Rankin studied as much as he could during this time, and in the process, his congregation began to take notice. Encouraged by the support of this small church, he decided to stay in Kentucky, not just for another 6 months, but for another 4 years until the end of 1821. These years in Kentucky were critical in preparation for Rankin's life work. At the Concord Church, he found his voice. Many in the congregation at Concord were also involved in the Kentucky Abolition Society and were very receptive to Rankin's abolitionism, which was a nice change of pace compared to what he experienced in Tennessee. It was also, on the flip side, where he would face the first of many pro-slavery mobs who formed around him and as he tried to set up Sunday schools for slaves in the Bluegrass region. Experiencing these mobs made one disturbing thought hauntingly clear. The slavocracy would rather the souls of slaves remain lost than to give up any of its power. Nothing, Rankin thought, could be more anti-Christian than that. Now, with this being the case, Rankin completed his journey on New Year's Day, 1822, to free soil by crossing the Ohio River with his family into the community of Ripley, Ohio. The town he walked into was unfriendly, to say the least, to both abolitionists as well as to preachers, but was especially unreceptive to an abolitionist preacher. Ripley was at this time a prototype saloon town that we might become more accustomed to experiencing in the Old West. There were shootouts and muddy, whiskey-fueled brawls in the streets, and taverns significantly outnumbered any churches. While his settlement, and while these challenges into his settlement into Ripley was certainly daunting, nothing would prepare him for the shock that he would feel in December of 1823 when Rankin received a letter from his brother Thomas. This felt like a betrayal, what would otherwise be a pleasant correspondence, Thomas informed John that he was recently becoming a slaveholder. Now it took John 8 months to find the words to respond to Thomas. It felt like a betrayal both to his family as well as to God. What's more, Rankin thought, if his own brother could succumb to the influence of the slavocracy, what hope was there to defeat slavery in the first place? So, on August 17th, 1824, John Rankin started a public letter campaign addressed to his brother on the subject of slavery. These letters were published in the local newspaper, the Castigator, every week until February 22nd, 1825. Rankin would explain to his brother and subsequently the readers of the Castigator that, quote, the love of gain first introduced slavery into the world and has been its constant support in every age. It was the love of gain that first enslaved the African race and now invents every possible argument against their emancipation. Now, to the modern ear, and perhaps to many in this audience, this may sound like a critique of a profit-motivated free market system. But looking at Rankin's arguments in the proper historical and theological context, it is clear here that Rankin is referring to a spirit of dominion that lures man into coveting his neighbor's status and property, and eventually to display power over his fellow man. As Rankin continued, his letters directly address the biblical justifications for slavery that Southerners would often employ. It was well known that, quote, many of the abettors of this system pretend to support it by the sacred scripture, he wrote. I deem it necessary to examine the principal arguments which they have drawn from this source. He spent considerable time examining the state of slavery in Scripture, particularly in ancient Israel. To Rankin, the similarities between American slavery and what was experienced in the Old Testament was in name only. Slavery in ancient Israel could be more appropriately be compared to indentured servitude. It was often a method for Israelites to pay off their debts, and was not, it should be noted, based on race. Most notably, in ancient Israel, there was, of course, the year of Jubilee, where the Israelites would proclaim liberty throughout the land. Of course, no practice ever existed in the United States. Rankin believes slavery in the United States more closely resembled the act of man-stealing, which was punishable by death in ancient Israel. Rankin also argued that Southerners who used Scripture to justify their status lost the forest through the trees. Quote, the whole Bible is opposed to slavery, he wrote to Thomas. He argued that Scripture is in fact, quote, one grand scheme of benevolence. Beams of love and mercy emanate from every page, while the voice of justice denounces the oppressor and speaks his awful doom. In closing, Rankin made a final plea to Thomas, praying that his brother would do justly, to love mercy, and to let the oppressed go free. And he added, can you refuse? If you do, I am your brother. I will not speak your doom. Now, in spite of his brother committing what is, in his view, one of the gravest sins, Rankin practiced in this moment an extraordinary level of grace and compassion as he closed his letters to Thomas. Fortunately, Thomas did not refuse, freeing his slaves just 2 years later in 1827. Rankin's letters swept the Ohio River Valley as they were first printed, becoming something of a local sensation. Believing that they could be wielded against the slaveocracy, Rankin had them bound and printed as a book shortly after the letters were released. As Rankin's letters on American slavery grew into notoriety, they eventually found their way into the hands of a young William Lloyd Garrison. These letters were credited by Garrison as, quote, the cause of my entering the anti-slavery conflict. He even went so far as to consider Rankin as his anti-slavery father and considered himself a disciple of Rankin's teachings. Garrison reprinted all of these letters weekly in his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. As the American Anti-Slavery Society was established, Garrison leaned on the guidance of Rankin throughout its formation, and the society used Rankin's letters as a form of textbook for newcomers to help them understand the moral arguments in favor of immediate abolition. While Rankin was far from the only influence that brought about the abolition movement of the 1830s and 40s, his influence was indeed essential to its creation and to its eventual success. I compare in my book Rankin's moral example for the abolitionist to that of what George Washington was able to provide during the early republic. As the movement began to splinter, the abolition movement began to splinter, Rankin served as a crucial center of gravity that all factions revered, admired, and respected. Now, this was in no small part due to his role on the Underground Railroad. Around the time Garrison began studying the letters on American slavery, John Rankin was building his hilltop home behind the Ripley community, and in time, this homestead would affectionately be referred to as Liberty Hill. His home quickly became a symbol of liberty and a beacon of hope for freedom seekers in their journey to Canada. His home was visible for miles, with a lantern shining through the window, signaling to escaped slaves in Kentucky that they would find refuge if only they could cross the river. Now, of course, not everyone who could see the lantern was in pursuit of freedom. Rankin's activities on the Underground Railroad infuriated plantation owners and slave catchers alike. Before the end of the 1830s, bounties were placed on his head, dead or alive, as high as $3,000, or roughly $100,000 in 2025. Men lurked in the shadows in darkness around Rankin's home, looking to cash in and rid the region of the so-called father of abolition. Eventually, this culminated in a dramatic fashion in September of 1841 when a firefight broke out on Rankin's hilltop house. He and his sons defended their home against a handful of Kentucky assassins. Fortunately, the only ones harmed were the intruders themselves, as they were pushed back across the river by Rankin's sons and several Ripley townsmen. This was a particularly jarring episode of violence that Rankin experienced as a result of his abolitionism, but it was hardly the only one. Throughout his life, Rankin faced the full might of the slavocracy. In the midst of this struggle, Rankin and so many other colleagues of his exposed an important truth about the institution and its relation to the state and to violence. Today, academics like to link the spread of slavery in the United States to certain principles that are fundamental to the American experiment. Federalism, property rights, and free markets, among others, have all been credited with helping to maintain slavery's dominance over the first 89 years of American history. Now, it is true that Southern slaveholders would often invoke such principles whenever it was very convenient for them to do so. But this came out of a desire to preserve the institution of slavery, slavery itself, rather than any genuine conviction in Republican or free market principles. By its nature, slavery erodes the people's liberty away. This, of course, was most apparent for the slave under the iron grip of the institution itself, but it did not stop there. Time and again, slaveholders would leverage the power of the state in order to preserve their own influence and authority, almost always coming at the expense of the civil and economic liberties enjoyed by the citizens of that state. In states like Virginia, for example, manumission laws were passed so that slaveholders were all but prohibited from emancipating their slaves. Slaveholders were very happy to invoke property rights whenever it came to enslaving another human being, but not whenever it came to freeing one. Civil liberties were also under constant threat from the slavocracy. Mobs would frequently surround John Rankin and his colleagues whenever they spoke out against slavery in an attempt to censor and intimidate. As Rankin went on, an anti-slavery speaking tour throughout Ohio, he and others were frequently pelted with rocks and eggs. He even started tethering his horse on the other side of town so that the anti-abolitionists wouldn't shave it and bob its tail. Newspapers were also a constant target of violence. James G. Birney's The Philanthropist out of Cincinnati was frequently ransacked and destroyed in an attempt to prevent the spread of abolitionist ideas. But the threats did not just come from mobs. Throughout the 1830s, abolitionists began to mail anti-slavery material, like Rankin's Letters on Slavery, to slaveholders as a ploy at moral suasion. This infuriated Southerners and soon caught the attention of the Jackson administration. Jackson's postmaster, Amos Kendall, had enough with the agitation and simply refused to have the abolitionist literature delivered. The censorship did not stop there. President Jackson himself decided to take it a step further, calling for Congress to, quote, prohibit under severe penalties of the circulation of in southern states through the mail of incendiary publications intended to instigate the slaves to insurrection. Rankin believed firmly in the founding principles of the United States. It was clear to him that the institution of slavery itself was poisoning the American experiment. And the longer it was allowed to exist, the more it would become entrenched into the fabric of the nation. So, whenever the Civil War did eventually break out in 1861, he considered it to be a providential act. He had worked his entire life to see that slavery was defeated as peacefully as possible, but war arrived nonetheless. With this being the case, Rankin believed it must be waged against slavery. Now, regardless of how the war started, the Civil War did in fact become an abolition war, to paraphrase Frederick Douglass. John Rankin witnessed the culmination of his life's work following the conclusion of the war when on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. On December 27th of that same year, in 1865, just a few short weeks after ratification, John Rankin reflected on the road traveled, as well as the journey ahead. In a rather lengthy editorial published in the Ripley Bee, he closed with a note of wisdom that I believe remains relevant to us to this day. God has most terribly poured out his righteous judgment upon the nation. And if we persist in our oppressions, he will visit us with a greater vengeance. Righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is the reproach of any people. If we would be exalted as a nation, it must be by righteousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. We will now have time for Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our mic runners will bring the mic to you. Please wait for the mic so our live stream audience can catch the question as well.
First question. I'm John Panera, Director of Research here at Acton. I have three questions, but I'm only going to ask one of them. I'm wondering if you could tell me more on Rankin's relationship with Charles Finney and with Lyman Beecher, who, when he wasn't engaged in anti-slavery activity, was engaged in anti-Catholic activity. So he's an interesting character. But especially Finney. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that they interacted a little bit. I'm not as sure on Finney, but I do know that Lyman Beecher was a good friend of Rankin's. And his Rankin's son went to Lane Seminary that Lyle was over and studied under his tutelage at a time. They did not always agree, I should add, on various issues, including slavery itself, where Rankin was more of an immediate abolitionist. That was kind of the revolutionary concept that he was bringing forth at the time. Lyman was much more in the gradual camp. But the entire Beecher family and Rankin was very close friends, and in fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in fact, utilized Rankin's storytelling abilities and incorporated that into her own story in Uncle Tom's Cabin during one of the more dramatic episodes of the book with the crossing of Eliza. That was a real story that she adopted from something that John Rankin experienced.
Hi. Two-part question, I guess. The first part is, you spoke of the fact that he was so respected within this abolition movement and why he maintained that, what you think his traits were, and part of that might have been his writing, and then also who helped him to stay faithful and persistent with all the influences he had against him.
Yeah, those are two good questions. I think part of his part of the respectability that he had came from his front lines, from the front lines that he was on the Underground Railroad. As I mentioned, he didn't go further north in the Western Reserve or further north to New England, where it would have been geographically removed from the threats of slavery. He was there, and he only went as far as he needed to. And I think that's carried a lot of influence, not just in the North among people like Garrison, but also in the South as well, because he was a Southerner at heart. He was from Tennessee. He never really intended to leave Tennessee. He was kind of forced up into free soil. And those things combined, I think, puts a lot of admiration and respect for everyone who interacted with him. Of course, being so early on in the movement and speaking out in such a state like that right there on the Ohio River contributed to that as well. And I would also say, Rankin was a very humble man, and I think that in part leads to why he's been largely forgotten throughout history. But I do think that humility ultimately, in any movement, there's a lot of personalities, as I'm sure you all are aware. And Rankin was not really a personality. He was someone who was just wanting to get the job done and accomplish the end goal, which was the end of slavery, and he didn't really care who took credit for things. And I think all those things combined really helped lend to his respectability. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
How he maintained his influence because of all of the, who were his encouragers who kept him?
Yes. So I would say that if his faith was the single greatest attribute in his life, but his family was a pretty close second. And his family was really a machine as far as the connectiveness and the community in Ripley. And I want to emphasize just how important the community aspect in Ripley was, because virtually everyone on the front street of Ripley, not everyone, but pretty close, a lot of the significant individuals throughout Ripley were conductors on the Underground Railroad, and they all worked with Rankin. Rankin was a leader of this community, but he was by no means the only person. And I think that combined with his family and his community that he experienced there in Ripley, he had a lot of support to give him the background that he needed.
Yep. You mentioned that Rankin was advocating for a peaceful resolution to slavery. As the abolition movement kind of heated up before the Civil War, do we have commentary from him on like Bloody Kansas or on John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal, or does he have any thoughts on John Brown?
This one always comes up. Understandably so, because John Brown is another fascinating figure. I was not able to find any direct commentary. It is, I think, apparent that they would have been very aware of each other, given the notoriety of both men, of both individuals. Speaking on the desire to, to find a peaceful resolution to slavery, he really abhorred violence, and I think this stems directly from the loss of his brother in the War of 1812. He wanted to do everything he could to avoid war while also addressing this grave injustice that he saw as America's great sin. But that does not mean that there were some abolitionists that really kind of, I think, they weren't very tactful. And Garrison, I think, is one example of an individual who kind of fell prey to that. For Rankin, the end was always the liberation of those in slavery. And sometimes abolitionists would kind of bicker over how to make that happen. But to Rankin, as long as it was ended immediately, or as long as someone in slavery was able to find their way to freedom, that was what really mattered. And sometimes him and even Garrison would butt heads over certain exact examples of that. But to him, that was what was most important.
I have a couple questions. First, I wasn't clear on what happened to Rankin in his later life. And secondly, it's obvious that this sort of a effort on your part has affected you, and I'd like to know how it has affected you. So what happened to Rankin in his later life? Because sometimes, we find out that virtue does not have its own reward. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we get lonely in the pursuit of what we're supposed to do.
Definitely. So after the Civil War, John Rankin sort of retired, quasi-retired, so to speak. He was still very active, but I think it's important to note that as I kind of highlighted throughout parts of this lecture, this was a calling to him. But all he really wanted to do was to preach in his congregation and kind of spread the gospel. It was not necessarily to pick up this fight against slavery. He felt like that's what God was telling him he needed to do. So after slavery was eventually defeated, he was hyper aware that there was still more work to be done. And in fact, in that last editorial that he wrote, he touches on things like that, like suffrage, for example, universal suffrage, equal protection under the law, things like that. But he also knew he was getting old at that point, and that there would need to be a new generation to take up that torch. So he largely stuck to preaching, but he did live another 20-some years. He died in 1886. So he was 93 years old whenever he died. And he was not necessarily wealthy in a traditional sense, but I think that he viewed his wealth coming from his family, and that was the main priority for him. As far as how it's affected me, so John Rankin is someone that I've known for quite some time because he died in the community that I grew up in Ironton, Ohio. And having known about him, in fact, the house that he died in is now the museum for the county there in Ironton. I've known about him, but it really wasn't until taking on this project that I fully grasped the significance of his story and having such an important figure, quite literally, right there in my backyard. And it surprised me how little had been written about him, despite his prominence. So those combination of factors and a few others kind of led me to going down that route. And I do think that Rankin is one of the most important figures in American history. And I think that it's going to take a while, but hopefully this book will help elevate him to that status. I think there was one back there first, and then we'll go there.
Does it work? Okay, great. One broader question about his background. Excuse me. So I'm wondering about the Presbyterian part of his story, and I'm particularly interested in whether or not he had any larger Presbyterian support from the Northern Presbyterians. I know the Southern Presbyterians were probably not fans, but I'm wondering, did he find any solidarity amongst the Northern Presbyterians? Were they trying to support him? Did they offer resources? What role did the Northern Presbyterians have to play in his story?
So there was, in this story, there's an episode of dramatic schism that takes place around the time that Rankin was becoming most active throughout the 1830s and 40s. And initially, Rankin was kind of in the old school camp of Presbyterian theology. Interestingly enough, his son kind of fell more into the new school camp. But the North-South divide didn't really touch on the issue of slavery the way that he had hoped. So by the late 1840s, Rankin, despite the fact that he was very outspoken against schisms, believing that that's not what Christ intended for the church, he kind of led his own schism in forming the Free Presbyterians in Ripley, Ohio, and throughout the region. He was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church at Ripley, and then he went on through these schisms, became the Second Presbyterian Church pastor, and then he became the pastor of the Free Presbyterian Church later on. So I think that kind of, to some degree, he was more hardlined, so to speak, on the issue of slavery within the church than even what he was within the context of politics. I think he understood that there was a political process that had to be navigated, and that not everything is going to be easy. But if the church is what it says it is, in Rankin's mind, then it has to be this moral banner for the world, this beacon of hope for all people. And he took that very seriously, even when it meant doing things that he, like through schisms, was not necessarily happy that it had to come to that. But he was a leader in that sense as well.
Thank you. Very. You mentioned Frederick Douglass.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how much they worked together, and also other black leaders, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, anyone else that he worked with.
So this was a point of curiosity whenever I started the book as well. Naturally, if Rankin was Garrison's mentor, and Garrison was so pivotal in Douglass's life, to me it seemed like their overlap was bound to happen. Because of the years that they operated, Rankin was very early on, and Douglass was kind of the next generation of abolitionists. There wasn't as much overlap, and also geographically, Douglass was more in the Northeast. But I was able to find at least one instance in which they did both speak at the same convention in Cincinnati in 1854, and it was kind of interesting to look at that convention because there was a time in which Rankin would have been the main speaker or the keynote speaker, but you can kind of see a passing of the torch, changing of the guard during this convention because Douglass was the one that everyone wanted to hear at this point. Now I can't confirm that they spoke with each other, but having been at several conventions and just kind of knowing how those things operate, and also knowing the provenance of both individuals, I think it's very likely that they would have certainly known of each other's presence, if not interacted. Again, I can't prove that, but I think logically it does make sense. Most of probably the most significant black leader that he interacted with is one that is also someone that I don't think that many people are aware of, by the name of John Parker, who eventually made his way to Ripley and became a very impactful conductor in the Ripley community. He kind of helped change a lot of things in Ripley. And Parker was someone who I think was another rock in Rankin's life, to kind of help him navigate through certain, sometimes very dramatic episodes in Ripley, Ohio.
Do you see any lessons in Rankin's anti-slavery movement from which we can learn in today's anti-abortion movement?
I've been waiting for this question. I think that, well, let me start with this. I think that slavery was a very unique circumstance in American history, and even today, I don't think anything quite compares to it in the scale of influence that it did have. Pro-life advocates are relatively protected under the rule of law, whereas it was far less so for abolitionists at the time. I do think that Rankin's life and the entire anti-slavery movement kind of demonstrates the extent in which faith plays in any movement. And I think that any time, as I was kind of alluding to in the beginning of this lecture, we like to think of ourselves as like, oh, if I were there, I would have spoken out. I would have done things differently. The same thing with like the Holocaust or something like that. If I were there, I would have helped them. And I think in today's world of comfort and really, morally gray nature, that most of us, in a society sense, I don't think that most of us would go out and kind of risk the safety of our family and do things like that. So, take that with what you will to apply to various political issues of our own day. I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage and selflessness that a lot of people in society today just don't really have. Anyone else?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I have a few brief announcements before I send you on your way. First, the bookshop is open here, and we will be selling Caleb's book, so feel free to stop by and talk with him and purchase a book. Just please turn in your name tags on your way out. We do reuse those, and then fill out the survey to let us know how you like this topic. There's a QR code on the screen as well as in your programs as well. 3 brief upcoming events I want to highlight for you. First, back here on March 13th, we'll be having a lecture with Dr. James Hartley, a kind of economic state of the union. So we'll talk about tariffs, trade wars, all the fun economic things happening right now. So please join us back here for that. Also, Acton University registration is now open. So please join us for that week-long conference here in Grand Rapids. And the early bird deadline is February 28th. And then also applications are now open for one of our free and virtuous society conferences on the topic of Is Solving Poverty Possible? And that is on April 10th through 12th. So if anyone you know in your network who's interested in that topic, that will be a fantastic kind of small group discussion engagement with that topic. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you back here soon. Thank you.